Pack your things and get out of the master bedroom by Monday. My husband of 30 years said those exact words to me across our Thanksgiving dinner table. I was in the middle of carving a 20-pound turkey in the dining room of our $3.5 million Alexandria home. He took a sip of his scotch and told me he was selling the house to fund our son-in-law's new tech startup. He suggested I find a quiet one-bedroom apartment in the suburbs. I just smiled and kept slicing the meat. What Richard did not know was that I am not a helpless housewife. I am a former forensic accountant, and he does not own a single brick of the house he was trying to kick me out of. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to smile through the absolute disrespect of someone who thinks they hold all the cards. My name is B. I am 62 years old, and this is the story of how I legally dismantled my ungrateful family before the pumpkin pie was even served. Let me take you right into that dining room so you can feel the exact moment my marriage ended. It was 8 o'clock on a Thursday night in Virginia. The air outside was freezing and snow was just beginning to fall, but inside it was warm and smelled of roasted garlic and expensive sage stuffing. The crystal chandelier hung above us, casting a golden glow over the fine china and the heavy silver cutlery. It looked like the perfect cover of a holiday luxury magazine. But the atmosphere in the room was suffocating. I stood at the head of the long mahogany table, holding a heavy silver carving knife resting the blade against the crisp skin of the turkey. Richard sat at the opposite end, leaning back in his custom leather chair. He is 65 years old, a former regional sales director who still wears tailored Italian suits to family dinners just to remind everyone he used to be important. He swirled the amber liquid in his crystal glass and looked at me with an expression of pure boredom. He did not look like a man asking his wife for a favor or discussing a joint financial decision. He looked like a corporate executive laying off a redundant employee. He cleared his throat and adjusted his silk tie before delivering the blow. B. I have made a decision, he announced loud enough so our daughter and son-in-law could hear every word. We are sitting on way too much equity in this Alexandria property. Marcus needs seed money for his new venture, and the housing market is peaking right now. I am putting this place on the market next week. You need to start packing your personal items immediately. The master suite needs to be staged for real estate photos by Monday, so you can move your things down to the basement guest room for now. Eventually, you should start looking for a small rental out in Fairfax. A one-bedroom apartment should be plenty of space for a woman your age. I stopped moving completely. The silver knife hovered an inch above the porcelain platter. The sheer audacity of his words hung in the air, heavy and toxic. He was talking about the home I had meticulously decorated, the gardens I had planted with my own hands, and the life I had built for 3 decades. He spoke as if my presence was a temporary inconvenience that he was finally ready to resolve. He assumed because I had spent the last 15 years playing the quiet, supportive wife that I was completely dependent on his good graces. He thought my silence over the years was submission. It was not. It was observation. When Richard almost went bankrupt 15 years ago due to a series of reckless gambling debts, I stepped down from my high-stress career as a commercial real estate appraiser to manage his financial mess. I smiled for his colleagues, I hosted his lavish dinners, and I let him pretend he was the undisputed king of his castle. I gave him the illusion of power to save his fragile ego from shattering. Now he was using that same fake power to try and throw me onto the street. He took another slow, confident sip of his drink, his eyes daring me to argue with him. He wanted me to cry. He wanted me to make a scene or beg him to let me stay. He fed on that kind of desperation. Instead, I felt a cold, absolute clarity wash over me. I looked at his arrogant face, at the smug curve of his mouth, and I realized I did not love this man anymore. I did not even pity him. I pressed the blade down and sliced cleanly through the turkey bone. The sharp crack echoed in the silent dining room, making him flinch just a fraction. I placed the meat on a serving tray and wiped my hands slowly on a linen napkin. I did not scream. I did not throw my wine glass at the wall. I just looked at him with the cold, calculating eyes of a forensic accountant who had spent 6 months preparing for exactly this moment. The game was over. I stood there, the knife still resting on the oak table. The air in the dining room had turned thick and heavy after my husband's words. Instead of defending the mother who had given her life, my own daughter, Chloe, slowly set down her wine glass. 34 years old, with perfectly sculpted brows, she looked at me with naked pity. "Mom, stop looking at Dad like that." Chloe snapped, her icy voice slicing through the silence. "Dad is doing the right thing. Marcus is in the most critical fundraising stage of his startup. Dad is the only person in this house who actually understands business. You need to start thinking ahead for once." I blinked at the daughter I had carried in my body, the daughter I had stayed awake for through countless nights whenever she was sick. The daughter whose private school tuition I had paid with money I scraped together penny by penny before I ever stopped working. Chloe smoothed the crease of the gorgeous green silk dress she was wearing, then tilted her chin toward her husband. "Just look at him, Mom. This is what a real man looks like when he takes care of his family. This designer dress, Marcus bought it for me last week for Thanksgiving. Almost $3,000. He knows how to make money, and he knows how to spoil his wife. Maybe you should learn to respect the people who actually hold this family up, instead of standing there acting offended." She kept going, her voice growing more arrogant with every word. "You've been drifting around this house for 15 years. Your savings, this house, these parties, Dad built all of it. All you do is arrange flowers and go drink tea with your old friends. The least you can do is make one small sacrifice. So what if you move down to the basement for a few months? Honestly, you should be grateful. Dad is even letting you stay in this house." Every word landed like a blade straight through my chest. But I didn't cry. I simply stood there, studying every expression that crossed her face. She was so proud of that wonderful husband of hers. Richard sat at the head of the table, smiling with smug satisfaction, nodding along with his daughter. They truly believed those lies. They truly believed I was some useless, parasitic, stupid old woman. But here was what Chloe did not know. Marcus had not bought that dress. The week before, Marcus's credit card had been declined at the mall. Chloe had called me in tears, saying she needed money to cover living expenses. I had taken pity on her and handed over the secondary card in my name, a card I kept for emergencies. And that $3,000 dress had been charged to my credit line. Marcus did not have a dollar to his name. He was nothing but a fraud, a hollow little pretender using his mother-in-law's money to buy gifts for his wife and bask in her worship. I looked at Marcus. He was still sitting there in silence, wearing that crooked smirk. He knew exactly whose card had paid for that dress. He knew exactly how deep his startup was drowning in debt. But he said nothing. He let his wife humiliate her own mother because it served him. 15 years ago, I had shut the door on a brilliant career with my own hands. I had been a commercial real estate appraiser and a forensic accountant. I made more money than Richard ever did, but when he fell, when he buried himself in catastrophic debt, I was the one who stepped in and cleaned up the wreckage. I used my own money to save his reputation. I stepped back. I played the role of the quiet housewife, so Richard could rebuild the fragile self-respect he called manhood. I sacrificed my career to protect the perfect shell of this family. And now that very sacrifice had been sharpened into a weapon against me. They called my protection dependence. They called my patience stupidity. Chloe took another sip of wine, her eyes drifting across the lavish living room. "Next week, I'll have someone come redo the master bedroom," she said to Richard, completely ignoring my presence. "Marcus needs a bigger workspace. We'll move in there for now while we handle the sale of the house. As for Mom's things, if anything is too old, just throw it out. There won't be room for all that stuff in the basement anyway." They were dividing up my territory right in front of me, stripping me of everything I had, from my dignity and my honor to the very place where I laid my head at night. They thought I was too old, too fragile, too terrified of loneliness to do anything but bow my head and accept it. I stood there and drew in one slow, deep breath. The cold air filled my lungs and brought with it perfect clarity. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger is for people you still expect something from. For the people sitting around that table, I felt only a deep and aching pity, because they were about to learn the most expensive lesson of their lives. I remembered Chloe's college graduation. I had ironed her gown with my own hands. I had stood beneath the blistering sun for 4 straight hours just to get her one perfect photograph. I had bought her first car with my own private savings so she could drive to work. I had given her everything a mother could give, hoping she would become an independent woman, someone who valued hard work and understood the meaning of family. Instead, I had created a perfect copy of Richard, selfish, shallow, utterly convinced she was the center of the universe. She looked at the woman who had given birth to her as if I were nothing but a burden, an obstacle that needed to be removed. "Oh, come on, Mom, don't be so dramatic." Chloe clicked her tongue when she saw I still hadn't moved. "It's not like we're throwing you out on the street. The basement is huge, it has heating, and honestly, you'll be living better than a lot of people out there. Once the house is sold and Marcus's company starts making money, we'll rent you a decent apartment. Dad has already decided, so stop being stubborn." The moment she finished, Richard tapped his fingers against the table, signaling that the discussion was over. He looked at me with the cold authority of a command. "You heard your daughter. Don't ruin Thanksgiving dinner. Go get more wine. And tomorrow start packing your things. I don't want to repeat myself a second time." Slowly, I set the knife down on the table. The sharp metallic sound against the oak rang through the room. Then I smiled, a small, gentle smile, but enough to make the entire room go still. What they did not know was this. The silence they mistook for surrender was not surrender at all. It was calculation, the calculation of a forensic accountant. What they did not know was that inside the handbag resting on my chair, I had every document I needed to throw every last one of them out of that house before the night was over. A suffocating silence swallowed the grand dining room. Richard had just ordered me to move into the basement. Chloe was still busy flaunting the designer dress she had bought with my money. And now finally Marcus decided it was his turn to speak. He leaned forward in his chair. Marcus was 36 years old, the kind of man who wrapped himself in the costume of a successful tech entrepreneur. He wore a black turtleneck under a tailored gray blazer, dressed in that carefully curated Silicon Valley uniform. Then he slid a thick stack of documents across the polished oak table toward me. "Mother B, you need to understand something." Marcus began, his voice low and smooth, dripping with condescension. He used my name with false intimacy. "The world is changing every day. We can't keep clinging to 20th century financial thinking. This house is a wasted asset. In startup language, we call this dead capital." Richard sees the bigger picture, and that's exactly why he agreed to invest in my venture. He smiled the kind of smile he clearly believed was persuasive. I simply stood there and watched him. I watched the way his fingers tapped against the table, a small nervous rhythm the kind liars often reveal without realizing it. "I know these concepts are difficult for you," Marcus continued, layering manipulation into every word. "You've been at home for 15 years. You're used to balancing grocery money and household expenses. You don't understand how cash flow works in a modern economy. My company is entering its seed round. We're building a disruptive technology platform with the power to transform the entire market. But to scale, we need leverage. And this house is that leverage." Then he pulled an expensive pen from the pocket of his blazer and laid it neatly on top of the documents. "These are the financial authorization papers and the ownership waiver," he said gently, as if he were explaining something to a toddler. "You just need to sign at the bottom right corner." My lawyer prepared everything. Once the house is sold, the capital will flow directly into the company. In 2 years, once we exit or raise the next round, the return multiple will be enormous, and then we'll buy you a nice little apartment in the suburbs, cozy, comfortable. You won't have to worry about cleaning such a large house anymore. He was trying to convince me that stripping me of my home was some kind of gift. He hid behind words like cash flow seed round exit strategy, return on investment, throwing up a wall of jargon thick enough to choke the truth. He was convinced that a 62-year-old woman would be overwhelmed by the language, frightened by the complexity, and too insecure to question him. He thought I would sign because I would be afraid of seeming outdated. "Mother B, you have to trust Richard and me," Marcus said, leaning back in his chair, folding his hands together like a man delivering wisdom. "Women your age tend to cling to the false security of brick walls, but real security comes from the earning power of an asset. What do you gain by holding on to this house? It creates no surplus value. You're standing in the way of this family's future. Chloe and I are building an empire. We need your sacrifice today to secure a brilliant tomorrow for the next generation." I listened to every word. Empire, surplus value, obstacle. He was using the exact kind of manipulation that Silicon Valley frauds use to drain money from naive investors. Paint a glorious future, hide a desperate present, sell the dream, conceal the failure. Beneath all that polished language was one brutal truth. He was a failed man drowning and desperately searching for something to grab before he sank. "Don't bother trying to analyze those contracts," Marcus scoffed when he noticed me glance at the file. "They're full of legal clauses that even educated people struggle to understand unless they work in the field. All you need to know is that Richard has already read them and agreed. You've listened to him for 15 years, haven't you? This is no different. Be a good wife. Be a selfless mother. Sign the papers so we can get back to enjoying Thanksgiving dinner." He pushed the documents a little closer. He was so arrogant now he didn't even bother hiding the contempt in his eyes. He looked at me the way a man looks at an old piece of furniture, outdated, silent, easy to move out of the way to make room for his fantasies. What he did not know was that the woman standing in front of him was not some clueless housewife. What he did not know was that I had once been a professional forensic accountant, a woman who hunted dirty money, fraudulent reports, and corrupt executives exactly like him. I looked at the gleaming pen on the table. I looked at Marcus's triumphant face, at Chloe's smug expression, at Richard's crooked little smile. The three of them were working together to corner me. They thought they had calculated every move. They thought victory was already theirs. They dressed up betrayal in beautiful language technology, startups' cash flow growth, when what they were really committing was the ugliest kind of family crime treachery. But they had made one fatal mistake. They had underestimated the intelligence of a woman who had lived long enough to know exactly what monsters looked like. They thought that because I had been silent for 15 years, I had forgotten how to think. They did not understand that during those 15 years, I had watched every shift in the financial markets. I had managed every dollar of savings with my own hands. And quietly, patiently, I had built a legal fortress around myself. Marcus was still waiting for me to pick up the pen. His patience began to crack. "Mother B time is money," he said, tapping the face of his gold-plated watch. "In business, every second can determine the success or failure of a deal. Don't waste our time any longer. Sign the papers, and you can go back to your little domestic routine. Bake another apple pie if you want. Leave the important matters to the men." The sexism in his voice, the contempt for age, the casual cruelty of it, none of it enraged me anymore. It only hardened my resolve. I did not need to argue with him. I did not need to explain liquidity ratios or actual profit margins. I was going to teach him a lesson in the only language he worshipped: money and the cold brutality of the law. Inside my mind, every fact about Marcus's company was already lined up in perfect order. I knew exactly how fast his so-called startup was burning cash. I knew he had spent tens of thousands of dollars on lavish parties to create the illusion of success instead of investing in real technology. I knew he was buried under a mountain of debt and that no bank was willing to touch him. This house was his last life raft, and he was trying to drown me to keep himself afloat. He talked about leverage, yet failed to understand the most basic truth about leverage: it only works when it rests on something solid. And the only thing holding him up now was bottomless greed and the cruelty of people willing to sell out their own family. Marcus adjusted his blazer again, trying to look powerful. "You know, there are many people out there who would beg to be part of this project," he said. "They're lining up to invest in me. But I chose family. I wanted to keep this opportunity inside the people I love most. You should feel honored." He lied so smoothly it was obvious he had started believing his own lies. Men like him always amused me in the most revolting way. They brag about changing the world, yet can't even pay for dinner without using someone else's money. Marcus was the perfect product of a delusional generation. Men who believe that memorizing a few economic buzzwords makes them clever enough to manipulate people who spent a lifetime working, sacrificing, and building something real. So I kept my silence. In negotiations, silence is always the most terrifying weapon. It forces the other side to keep talking, to keep filling the void, and the more they talk, the more they expose themselves. Marcus began to falter. He cleared his throat. His eyes flicked nervously around the dining room. Then they landed on Richard, searching for support. Richard took a sip of wine and finally spoke. "Sign it be. The boy is right. You don't understand business. Don't make this more complicated than it needs to be. We're handling this in the most civilized way possible." Their collusion was disgusting. A treacherous husband and a worthless son-in-law joining forces to crush one woman. They were using that authorization paper like a death sentence for my financial freedom. They wanted me to strip myself of every right I had with a single stroke of ink. They wanted me to walk out of this house with nothing making room for their diseased ambitions. I drew in one slow breath. The Thanksgiving air in that room no longer smelled of roasted food or warm celebration. It smelled of greed, of deception, of rot. I looked at the authorization papers sprawled across the oak table. The black print on white paper almost seemed to mock me. But they did not know the truth. Those papers were worthless. Because this house, this land, this entire property was not jointly owned. It belonged to a separate legal entity I had created with painstaking care. I had never imagined I would one day have to use my forensic accounting skills against my own family. But life has a way of forcing your hand when the people you once loved back you into a corner. And when that happens, you learn something devastating. Kindness is useless against the ungrateful. Only absolute power and absolute coldness can protect you. And I was ready to launch a counterattack so devastating that the 3 people sitting in front of me would remember this Thanksgiving for the rest of their lives. Slowly, I reached my hand toward the center of the table. My fingers brushed across the cold oak surface and came to rest over Marcus's gold-plated pen. All 3 of them held their breath, watching my every movement. Chloe took a delicate sip of wine, her face glowing with anticipation. Marcus leaned forward, his eyes lit with the greedy triumph of a con man who thought he was seconds away from striking gold. And Richard, he folded his arms across his chest and smiled with smug satisfaction, like a king who had just crushed a tiny rebellion in his kingdom. They truly believed I had given up. They thought the weight of their threats, the isolation inside my own home, and the betrayal of my own daughter had finally broken me. In their eyes, I was nothing more than a 62-year-old woman who was exhausted, frightened, and out of options. A lonely old woman with nowhere to go, no one to turn to, and no choice but to sign the death warrant for her own future. My fingers touched the cool metal of the pen. That sensation, the sharp chill of metal against skin, dragged me back to the years when I sat in corporate boardrooms at major accounting firms, million-dollar contracts, brutal negotiations, rooms where a single signature could determine the fate of an entire company. I had once held that kind of power in my hands, and now these amateurs dared to threaten me with a cheap authorization form. I lifted the pen. At that exact moment, I saw Marcus's chest rise and fall in quiet relief. He was already breathing easier, convinced that the money to save his pathetic startup was finally his. Chloe smiled faintly and glanced down at her designer dress as if she were already calculating how many more luxury things she could buy with the money from selling my house. I lowered the tip of the pen toward the paper. The authorization form was covered in thick black print, line after line of clauses designed to strip me of every claim to the house I had paid for. The blank space for my signature waited in the bottom right corner. I stopped there. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3. The silence in the dining room tightened like a wire ready to snap. "Good girl, Mom," Chloe whispered at last, her voice soft with fake sweetness as it shattered the stillness. "Just sign it. Then everything will be fine." But the instant the tip of my pen hovered less than a millimeter above the page, a shrill sound ripped through the silence of Thanksgiving night. The doorbell. It rang again. And again. Fast. Urgent. Merciless. Like an alarm siren. The sound echoed from the front hall and slammed against the oak-paneled walls, making every one of us flinch. My hand froze. I lifted my eyes toward the dark hallway. Who could possibly be arriving at this hour on a freezing snowstorm night when everyone else in the world was gathered with their families? I turned to Richard, about to ask whether he had invited someone else, but what I saw on his face made the blood in my veins turn to ice. Richard did not look surprised, not even slightly. Instead, the corner of his mouth slowly curled into the vilest, most cruel smile I had seen in all our 30 years together. "Sign it quickly, Bea," he growled, his eyes gleaming with savage mockery. "The new owner of this house is here." Then his smile widened. "And trust me," he said, his voice dripping with malice, "you do not want to keep her standing outside in the snow." The doorbell was still echoing through the grand foyer. Richard smiled, slow, vicious smile, and stepped out of the dining room. The sound of his footsteps rang across the oak floor as he made his way to the front door. I stood there, the turkey knife still lying on the table. Marcus and Chloe seemed to be holding their breath. Then the heavy oak door swung open, and a blast of freezing wind from the snowstorm outside poured into the house. But the coldest thing that entered that night was not the weather. It was the woman who stepped across my threshold. Her name was Sienna, 28 years old. Bright blonde hair styled into perfect curls. Lips painted a sharp, glossy red. She was wearing a white mink coat that radiated wealth, arrogance, and calculation. Behind her, she pulled 3 oversized designer suitcases. She walked into my house without the slightest hesitation, not like a lost guest arriving in a storm. She walked in like the new owner. Richard immediately opened his arms to her, right in front of me, right in front of our daughter and son-in-law. He wrapped his arm around Sienna's waist, pulled her close, and kissed her cheek with the warm familiarity of a man greeting someone who belonged there. "You're right on time, darling," he said in a low, satisfied voice. "Everything is almost settled." Sienna giggled, rested her head against his shoulder, and then lifted her eyes to me. There was no guilt in that gaze, no shame, no hesitation, only triumph, only challenge. Her eyes swept over me from head to toe, taking in the apron I was still wearing. Then she smiled with open contempt. "Hello, Bea," she said in a sugary voice, though every word was edged like glass. "Whatever you're cooking smells wonderful. Such a shame, though, because from now on I'll be taking over this kitchen." The entire dining room dropped into a suffocating silence. For 1 second my heart seemed to stop. Not from heartbreak, from sheer disbelief at the depth of human shamelessness. Richard, the husband I had lived beside for 30 years, the man whose dignity I had sacrificed my brilliant career to protect, was now standing in our home on Thanksgiving night, with his arm around his mistress, as if this were the most natural thing in the world. Richard cleared his throat, adjusted the front of his blazer, and turned to me with cold authority. "Bea, I'm not going to waste time with excuses anymore," he declared, his voice ringing with that false, self-important power men like him love to wear. "Sienna and I have been together for 8 months. She's the only woman who truly understands my pressure, my ambition, my vision. Next week, my lawyer will send you the divorce papers. Everything has already been prepared." Then he gestured toward the 3 expensive suitcases sitting proudly on the rug. "Tonight, Sienna is officially moving in. She can't stay in that cramped apartment anymore. She needs space, and I want her living in a home worthy of her. So you have 2 hours to gather your personal things. Sleep in the basement. The master bedroom upstairs belongs to Sienna and me now." Every word landed like a hammer blow against the years of youth I had buried inside this family. He was throwing me out of the very bedroom where I had chosen every paint color, every curtain, every detail with my own hands. He was sending me down to a cold basement so that a girl younger than our own daughter could sleep in my bed. I looked at Sienna. She was smoothing Richard's lapel, her face glowing with smug satisfaction. She thought she had won some grand prize. She thought capturing an older, wealthy man guaranteed her a silk-lined future. She looked at me as though I were an outdated piece of furniture, the final obstacle that needed to be removed before she could step onto her throne. "Bea, don't make this harder for Richard." "Sienna," said her voice dripping with fake sympathy, "he's suffered through this cold marriage for far too long. You should have enough dignity to leave quietly. I promise I won't touch your little things in the basement. And once the house is sold, I'll make sure he gives you a small amount to live on in retirement. Doesn't that sound fair?" She was offering me charity with my own money. The brazenness of it was beyond imagination. She was standing inside a house I had paid for on land titled in my name, and she dared to distribute pity like she was a queen handing out alms. But the thing that chilled me most was not Sienna's arrival, not Richard's cruelty. It was the silence of the other two people in that room. I turned to Chloe and Marcus. My own daughter, the child I had protected for 34 years, did not look shocked. She did not look horrified. She did not rise to defend the mother being humiliated in front of her eyes. She simply lifted her wine glass, took a slow sip, and looked away. And in that instant, a terrible truth struck me with full force. They knew. Chloe and Marcus had known about the affair all along. Worse than that, they had accepted it. Richard had almost certainly promised to use the house sale to rescue Marcus's collapsing company, and in return, they had agreed to stay silent while he brought his mistress home. They had formed a devil's alliance, a blood-soaked agreement to carve me apart right there at the family table. There they stood, four greedy, cruel, ungrateful people, fully convinced they had backed me into a corner. They thought a 62-year-old woman would crumble. They wanted tears. They wanted screaming. They wanted me on my knees begging. I did not give them that privilege. I stood tall. My shoulders did not tremble. I looked Richard straight in the eye, then slowly turned my gaze to Sienna. And inside my mind, every number, every legal clause, every financial record, every piece of evidence I had gathered over the last 6 months began to lock into place like steel bars closing around a prison cell. I was no longer a betrayed wife. I was a forensic accountant preparing to deliver judgment. The humiliation did not weaken me. It sharpened me. It honed my coldness into something lethal. They thought they controlled this game, but they were wrong. This game had only just begun. My shock at the mistress's triumphant smile was quickly crushed by something far more horrifying. For 30 years as a mother, I had always believed that no matter what happened, children would stand by the woman who had sacrificed everything for them. I waited for Chloe to leap up from the dinner table. I waited for her to hurl her wine glass against the wall, or at the very least scream at that woman to get out of the house. But my daughter did no such thing. She calmly set her napkin down, rose from her chair, and walked toward the door. She passed right by me without even looking at me once. She went straight to Sienna, the woman only 6 years older than she was, the woman standing there with her hand looped around my husband's arm. And then right in front of my wide, disbelieving eyes, Chloe opened her arms and embraced her. "Hi, Auntie Sienna," my daughter said, her voice so sweet and natural it made me sick. "Was it freezing out there? We were waiting for you so we could have dessert." Sienna giggled, adjusted her hair, and patted Chloe gently on the back. "Thank you, sweetheart," she replied. "I brought the cake you love most. Your father said you were craving something sweet." My heart stopped. The air vanished from my lungs. Auntie Sienna, my own daughter, the child I had raised with my own hands from the day she was born, was calling her father's Mistress Auntie with warmth, affection, and familiarity. What stood before me was not some awkward first encounter. The ease between them, the fluency in their gestures, the intimacy in their voices, it all proved one thing. They had known each other for a long time. I took a step forward, my voice trembling but cold as ice. "Chloe, what is this? What on earth are you doing? Do you even know who this woman is?" Chloe turned to look at me, and the irritation on her face was unmistakable. "Mom, can you please stop making a scene?" She sighed, releasing Sienna and folding her arms across her chest. "Of course I know Auntie Sienna. She's the one who helped Marcus connect with an angel investment fund in Silicon Valley. She's wonderful. Dad has been so much happier since he met her. You need to accept reality and act like an adult." I turned to Marcus. My son-in-law was still sitting at the table, casually swirling his crystal glass in his hand. He smirked a slow, mocking half-smile. "Mother B," he said calmly, as if he were presenting a financial report. "We're all adults here. Your marriage to Richard has been cold for a long time. He needed new inspiration to keep going. And more importantly, Auntie Sienna is a strategic partner for my company. You can't let your personal selfishness destroy this family's future." My head spun. Strategic partner. New inspiration. Those disgusting, ridiculous phrases were coming from my own son-in-law's mouth to justify his father-in-law's betrayal. I stared at Marcus, then at Chloe. Neither of them looked ashamed. Neither of them tried to hide anything anymore. They were openly defending the woman who had helped destroy this family. How long, I asked, each word scraping out of me, my chest aching as if thousands of needles were piercing it. "How long have you known?" Chloe clicked her tongue and rolled her eyes toward the ceiling. "About 8 months, Mom. The first time Dad brought Auntie Sienna to dinner with us was back in March. He introduced her properly. We saw how happy she made him, so we were happy for him. You have to understand, Mom. Lately you've been nagging all the time. You're getting older. You're not suited for Dad's social events and business dinners anymore. He needs someone young and energetic by his side. Auntie Sienna does that very well. 8 months. They had known about his affair for 8 whole months. For 8 months they had still come to my house for dinner every weekend. They had still accepted gifts from me. Chloe had still called me every time she wanted a new handbag or needed someone to pay off her credit card bill. Marcus had still smiled and called me Mother B every time he needed money to maintain the illusion that he was some successful entrepreneur. They had eaten the food I cooked, spent the money I earned, and behind my back they had sat down to dinner with their father's mistress. They had helped him turn me into a fool. But why, I asked, even though the answer was already rising in my mind like poison, why would a daughter be cruel enough to sell out her own mother like this? And then I remembered the timing. 8 months ago. That was when Marcus lost his biggest investor. That was when his startup began collapsing under the weight of its own failure. He had begged me to pull money out of my retirement fund to save him, and I had refused because I knew his company was a bottomless pit. My eyes moved from Chloe to Richard. He was standing there with his arm around Sienna, his face swollen with smug satisfaction. "How much did he pay you?" I asked, and now my voice no longer shook. It had turned into ice. "How much did he promise you to make you call her Auntie and help him push me out of my own home?" Marcus frowned slightly. He set his wine glass down and rose to his feet. "That's insulting," he said. "This isn't a transaction. It's a rational arrangement that benefits everyone. Richard agreed to sell this house. He's putting $500,000 into my seed round. In return, he gets the freedom to live openly with the woman he loves. Chloe and I get the capital we need to take our technology platform to the next level. Everyone wins. You're the only one clinging to a title that no longer means anything. $500,000. $500,000 pulled from my house in exchange for their silence and their loyalty to him. They had sold motherhood. They had sold 30 years of my youth. They had sold my sacrifices, and the price was $500,000. They had written a devil's contract on my back. Richard bought himself freedom and a young mistress. Marcus and Chloe bought themselves the money to continue their fake lifestyle and their startup fantasy. And I was the sacrificial offering, the obstacle that had to be removed so they could divide the spoils. "Disgusting," I whispered, but loud enough for all 4 of them to hear. "You are nothing but parasites." Chloe changed instantly. The fake sweetness vanished, replaced by the rage and insolence of a spoiled child finally exposed. "Mom, enough," she shouted, stepping toward me. "You always act like you're so noble. You always play the victim. You've stayed home and lived off Dad for 15 years. You haven't earned a single dollar. This house is Dad's money. My future and Marcus's future matter more than your old wounded pride. Move to the basement and sign the papers. Don't make us use force. If you keep acting crazy like this, Marcus will call a lawyer and have you committed. You already have that medical report from last month about insomnia and depression. We'll declare you mentally incompetent. You won't have anything left." She threatened me. The daughter I had given birth to was threatening to use a medical record twisted into a weapon to have me locked away in a psychiatric institution so they could steal everything. Her words were so cold, so ruthless, that even Richard raised an eyebrow slightly, though he said nothing to stop her. They had planned this. Every detail, every angle, every possible response I might have had, they had already prepared to crush. Sienna stood by the doorway with her arms folded, smiling with smug delight. She was watching a family tragedy unfold like it was entertainment, and in her mind, she had already won. She did not need to do much. All she had to do was use her youth to shatter a family and then let greed finish the rest. "You heard her," Marcus said coldly. He stepped closer to the table and tapped the authorization papers with one finger. "You have no allies in this house. Accept reality. Your era is over. Sign the papers, pack your things, and we can finish this tonight without having to call the police or an ambulance." The four of them closed in around me. Together, they formed a wall of ingratitude, greed, and betrayal. They were certain I was standing on the edge of collapse. They were waiting for tears, for pleading, for panic. They believed the sheer weight of isolation would finally break whatever strength I had left. But they were wrong. When pain reaches its highest point, it stops being weakness. It becomes a weapon, sharp, cold, merciless. I looked at each of their faces in turn. The anguish inside me faded, and in its place came something far more dangerous, contempt. They thought they were deceiving some foolish old housewife. What they did not know was that they had just awakened a legal monster. Slowly I set the knife down. Then I pulled my old handbag toward me. It was time to end this performance. It was time to show them who truly held the power of life and death in this house. I looked Marcus straight in the eye and slowly pushed the power of attorney papers back toward him. "I'm not signing." My voice was calm, steady, without the slightest tremor. "You and your honorable father-in-law can take this worthless piece of trash and throw it straight into the fireplace." The smug half-smile vanished from Marcus' face. He blinked, and for the first time that night, the polished composure of the fake tech entrepreneur slipped. My blunt refusal had not been part of his script. He let out a long, annoyed breath and rubbed a hand over his face as though he were dealing with a stubborn child. "Mother B, you're making this far uglier than it needs to be," Marcus said, his voice dropping into a hard, threatening tone. "We've tried to keep this as smooth and respectful as possible for your sake, but if you insist on choosing conflict, then I'm afraid you're leaving us with no other option." He reached for the leather briefcase resting on the empty chair beside him. The clasp snapped open with a dry metallic click that echoed through the stillness. Then he pulled out a pale yellow file and dropped it onto the oak table with a flat, heavy slap. "Do you know what this is?" he asked, tapping the cover, where the logo of one of the city's largest psychiatric clinics was printed. I glanced at the file. Of course I knew what it was. It was my medical record from last month. Marcus opened it, flipped to the first page, and began reading aloud in a cold, merciless voice. "Patient Beatrice Sterling, age 62. Symptoms: chronic insomnia, nervous exhaustion, extreme anxiety, and mild signs of hallucination. Attending physician's conclusion: patient is undergoing a severe psychological crisis, requires close supervision, and is not sufficiently lucid to make important decisions." Then he lifted his eyes to mine, and they had gone dark with threat. You see, numbers and medical reports don't lie. He was using the suffering this family had caused me as a weapon against me. Yes, I had gone to that clinic the month before because I could not sleep. I had lain awake night after night listening to Richard's secret phone calls in the middle of the night. I had been unraveling because I was beginning to see the full, filthy truth of what had been happening behind my back. But what none of them knew was that I had used that so-called nervous exhaustion as cover. While they believed I was too fragile to think straight, I had quietly slipped away from the house to meet with my own attorney and prepare for this exact moment. They thought I was falling apart. They thought I was losing my mind. And now my rotten son-in-law was using that report as his ultimate weapon. "My lawyer has already reviewed this file," Marcus said, leaning back in his chair and folding his hands together. Under Virginia state law, with medical evidence of cognitive decline like this, combined with the unstable behavior you've displayed tonight, we have more than enough grounds to petition the court. We can ask the judge to declare you legally incompetent." He spoke slowly, deliberately, making sure I heard every word. The cruelty on his face was no longer hidden. "And when the court grants it," he continued, his mouth curling into a vicious little smile, "legal guardianship over, you will be transferred to your closest relatives. That means Richard, or your daughter Chloe. Your assets, your bank accounts, your medical decisions, and ownership rights to this house will automatically pass into our control. At that point, we won't need you to sign a single document. The law will strip you of every human right you have. He was threatening to erase my freedom. He was threatening to turn me into a living ghost in the eyes of the law, a prisoner inside my own life. Mom, please don't force us to do that, Chloe chimed in, her tone drenched in fake sorrow. She stepped closer to the table, arms folded across her chest, pretending to be the concerned daughter. I'm only doing this because I care about your health. You haven't been yourself lately. You're irritable. You overreact to everything. If you stay alone in a house this big and you have some kind of breakdown, what then? Putting you in a professional care facility would be the best thing for you. There would be doctors there 24/7. You wouldn't have to worry about a thing. The best thing for me. The daughter I had brought into this world with my own body was standing there telling me that locking me away in a psychiatric institution so they could steal my assets was an act of love. She was willing to brand her own mother insane just so she could keep buying designer bags and funding the deadweight husband hanging around her neck. Richard stood there with his arm around Sienna, watching the whole performance with naked satisfaction. "You heard your daughter, B," he said, clearing his throat. "This is your last chance. Sign the papers, move into the basement, and tomorrow you can pack your suitcase and leave. I'll make sure you get a small monthly allowance, enough to survive in some modest apartment. But if you keep resisting, then next Monday you'll be standing in court. And trust me, once the law gets involved, you'll be taken straight to a locked psychiatric facility. They'll medicate you every day, and you'll never walk freely outside again." Sienna covered her mouth and let out a soft little laugh. "Oh dear, that sounds terrifying," she cooed. "B, you really should listen to Richard. Don't make life harder for yourself. You're 62 now. Legal battles will only age you faster and make you sicker. Let the younger people take over." The four of them stood around me, utterly convinced in the perfection of their plan. They had built an invisible iron cage out of law and medicine and lowered it over my head. They were certain that a housewife with no income, no visible power, and no allies would panic the moment she was faced with the prospect of being locked away in a psychiatric institution. They were waiting for me to break, waiting for my hands to shake, waiting for me to grab the pen, waiting for me to sign my own death sentence. Their cruelty had gone far beyond greed. They did not just want my house or my money. They wanted to erase me, silence me, strip me of my voice, my freedom, and my dignity. They wanted to bury me alive inside a nursing facility so they could dance on top of the fortune I had built with my own hands. Marcus shoved the power of attorney papers toward me again, along with the gold-plated pen. "Sign it, Mother," he ordered, his voice cold and final. "This is not a request. This is an ultimatum. Either you leave voluntarily with a little pocket money, or we take everything and throw you into a mental institution. The choice is yours." I stood there like stone. The air around us seemed to freeze solid. My heartbeat slowed steady and calm. Another woman might have collapsed. Another woman might have cried, screamed, or dropped to her knees, begging for mercy from the very people she had once loved. But I was not a weak woman, and what they were trying to steal was not the property of some senile old fool. I looked Marcus straight in the eye. Then slowly, the corners of my mouth began to lift. A real smile. A smile so cold that the temperature in the dining room seemed to drop. "You're threatening me with an insomnia diagnosis, Marcus." I said each word slow, clear, and precise. "Do you really think that's enough to steal a $3.5 million estate from me?" I did not wait for him to answer. I turned away from the papers and calmly pulled my old handbag closer. The sound of the zipper cut through the silence like a blade shattering their smug certainty. They had played every filthy card they had. Now it was my turn. And it was finally time to teach those arrogant children and my treacherous husband what real power looks like in the hands of a forensic accountant. The four of them stood around me in that lavish dining room. Richard had one arm wrapped around his young mistress. She wore a smug, victorious smile. My own daughter Chloe stood there with her arms folded across her chest, her face cold and merciless. And my son-in-law Marcus leaned against the edge of the table, his fingers tapping restlessly beside the power of attorney papers and the fabricated medical file. Together they formed a wall of intimidation. 4 pieces of human filth bound by a single purpose to crush the last fragments of pride left in a 62-year-old woman. They were convinced I had nowhere left to go. In their minds, an aging housewife abandoned by her husband, betrayed by her children, and threatened with a psychiatric institution was supposed to collapse. They were holding their breath, waiting for the moment I would burst into tears, waiting for my shoulders to shake, waiting for me to obediently pick up Marcus's gold-plated pen and hand over everything I owned with my own trembling signature. The rhythm in the room suddenly slowed. The silence grew so deep that I could hear the wind whistling through the window frames and the soft patter of snow against the porch roof. No one spoke. They were using silence as a weapon, hoping the pressure would crush me from the inside. But they were wrong. This silence did not belong to them. It belonged to me. Slowly, I let my gaze drift away from Marcus's triumphant face. I looked down at the oak table. The solid silver turkey knife was still lying there motionless, reflecting the light from the crystal chandelier overhead. I reached for it, but not to threaten them. I picked it up and carefully laid it off to one side of the table. A slow, deliberate gesture. A final gesture. As if I were setting down the last remains of the dutiful wife I had been for the past 30 years. Then I picked up the white linen napkin. Calmly, I wiped my fingers clean. I wiped away the grease from the meal. I wiped away the warmth of that fake Thanksgiving dinner, and I wiped away the foolish patience I had carried for more than a decade. They watched every movement with growing confusion. Richard's smile began to stiffen. Marcus stopped tapping his fingers against the table. They did not understand what was happening. A cornered woman was not supposed to move with that kind of calm. A victim was not supposed to look so composed. Then I tossed the napkin onto the table. After that, I reached toward the empty chair beside me where my worn black Hermes handbag had been resting. It was the only luxury item I had ever bought for myself, paid for with the last months of my own salary before I gave up my career 15 years ago. I placed the handbag on the table directly in front of the 4 of them. My hand touched the metal clasp. The sound of the zipper sliding open cut through the room, sharp, clear, and cold, tearing through the tension like a blade. What they did not know was this. Inside that old handbag, there were no tissues for tears. Inside it was a legal death sentence for their greed. I opened the bag slowly, then lifted my eyes to Richard's and smiled. "Your performance is over," I said softly. "This little formation of yours is disgusting." My smile deepened. "And now it's time for me to clean house." My hand rested inside the old leather handbag. But instead of immediately pulling out the legal documents and hurling them in their faces, I did something no one in that room expected. I withdrew my hand, leaving the file where it was, and calmly reached for the glass of red wine on the table. The ruby liquid shimmered inside the crystal stemware. I lifted it to my lips and took a small sip. The light, dry bite of the Pinot Noir slid down my throat, carrying with it a deep, absolute calm. Then I set the glass back down on the table, the soft sound of crystal touching wood ringing out in the silence. All 4 of them remained frozen in place, but the smug confidence on their faces had begun to crack. They could not understand why a woman cornered the way I was could still sit there and savor a glass of wine. Marcus cleared his throat. He tried to recover the air of authority he had been wearing all evening, the polished arrogance of a chief executive who thought he still controlled the room. Mother B were running out of time, he said, though there was far less confidence in his voice now than there had been 10 minutes earlier. "Stop dragging this out. Sign the papers and we'll leave you alone." I raised my eyes and looked straight at him. No fear, no anger, only a coldness sharp enough to cut bone. "Marcus," I said slowly, each word dropping from my mouth like a slab of stone. "Do you really think you can dazzle me with a few cheap startup buzzwords? Did you actually imagine that your rambling about cash flow seed rounds and return on investment could intimidate a former forensic accounting specialist from Deloitte? The moment the name Deloitte left my mouth, it was as if the air had been sucked out of the room. Marcus's tapping fingers stopped at once. The corner of his mouth twitched. His eyes widened as he stared at me like I had become a complete stranger. He took half a step back, and his breathing turned shallow and uneven. Chloe, standing beside him, went still too. She blinked rapidly, trying to process what I had just said. Forensic accounting. Those words did not belong to the version of me they had built in their minds. To them, I was only an old woman circling the kitchen, a wife who knew how to budget groceries and fuss over household details, a harmless shadow in an apron. I smiled, a thin, contemptuous smile. You use polished language to cover up an empty financial report, Marcus. I continued, my voice rising with a hard, ringing clarity. You talk about financial leverage, but the truth is, your company is drowning in short-term debt with no qualifying collateral worth mentioning. You talk about scaling, but your burn rate is so catastrophic, you won't survive another 3 months without fresh capital. You're an amateur con artist. And you had the nerve to stand in my house and use your half-digested economics vocabulary to lecture a woman who spent years dissecting multi-million-dollar fraud cases. Marcus's face drained white, then flushed a violent red. The entire costume of the successful tech entrepreneur collapsed in an instant. He opened his mouth to fire back, but his throat locked. No words came out, and in that moment, he understood. He understood that he had tried to perform a trick in front of someone who could read every lie in his worthless business plan with a single glance. But I was not finished. It was time to strip away every false mask in that room. I turned my gaze from my son-in-law to the man I had called my husband for 30 years. Richard still had his arm around Sienna, but his posture was no longer proud. His shoulders had begun to sag, and a thin sheen of sweat was gathering at his temples. You really thought I spent the last 15 years arranging flowers and baking pies because I was useless, Richard. I said, my voice now sharp as a blade. You told your mistress I was a dependent wife, didn't you? A burden. A woman living off your generosity. Sienna glanced at Richard, and for the first time, real uncertainty crossed her face. She had believed she was clinging to a powerful man, a man of influence, a man who controlled everything. But now that same man was standing there visibly shaken in front of a 62-year-old woman he had assumed was already defeated. 15 years ago, I went on laying out the truth without mercy. You came within inches of prison because of your reckless investments and your gambling addiction. Your business partners abandoned you. The banks were preparing to seize everything. You dropped to your knees in your own office and cried like a broken child. Who do you think cleaned up that disaster for you? Who used her expertise, her network, and her own savings to restructure those debts and save you from public ruin? Richard swallowed hard. His hand slipped away from Sienna's waist. He would not look me in the eye. The truth was being exposed in front of our daughter, our son-in-law, and most humiliating of all, in front of his young mistress. I could see his fragile male pride cracking open under the weight of it. I stepped back on purpose. I said each word, filling the vast room with crushing clarity. I gave up a senior executive position. I chose to play the quiet, faded housewife. Not because I was weak, not because I was tired, but because I wanted to preserve the last scraps of dignity you had left as a man. I let you put your name on meaningless contracts. I let you bask in the hollow praise of your friends so you would not have to face what you really were, a pathetic failure living off his wife's intelligence. I gave you a perfect mask to hide your incompetence. Chloe staggered back a step. Her hands, once so rigid with arrogance, now hung loose and trembling at her sides. The insolence had vanished from her face. She had never known any of this. She had grown up believing with absolute certainty that her father was the solid pillar of the family, and her mother was only a dependent shadow clinging to him. This truth hit her like a blow to the head. She turned to Richard, searching desperately for denial, for outrage, for some powerful rejection of what I had said. But Richard stood there in silence, his eyes lowered to the carpet. And that silence was confession enough. "And this is how you repay me," I asked, a bitter smile curling at my lips. "You drag some little tramp into my home. You conspire with a pack of ungrateful children to try to throw me into a psychiatric institution. Did you really think that a woman who chose to lower herself would never remember how to rise again? Did you think the mask of patience I wore for 15 years had somehow fused to my skin?" Then I reached into the Hermes bag again. This time, I did not hesitate. I wrapped my fingers around the thick file inside and pulled it out. They had played their psychological games long enough. They had waved around their threats, their worthless authorization papers, their fake confidence. Now it was my turn. Now they were about to learn what legal power really looks like. They were about to learn what numbers can do when they are arranged by a real expert. And this Thanksgiving night was about to become a night none of them would ever forget. I slid my hand into my black Hermes handbag again. This time my fingers closed around the cold cardboard surface of the first file. I pulled it out and gently tossed it onto the oak table. It slid a short distance and stopped directly in front of Richard. The sound of that folder hitting the table echoed through the room like a judge's gavel in an empty courtroom. Richard stared at it. His eyes blinked rapidly, struggling to hold on to that air of authority, but the hands hanging stiffly at his sides had already begun to tremble. For 15 years, he had grown used to me nodding quietly at every decision he made. He had not seen me handle a legal document since the day I stepped back and handed him center stage in the theater of our lives. "Open it, Richard," I ordered, my voice low and calm, but carrying the weight of ice. "Open it and read it out loud for your little mistress. Let her hear exactly what you truly own in this house." Richard swallowed. Slowly he reached forward and opened the file. The first page hit him like a blow. Bold legal language, notarized seals, authenticated signatures, every line in perfect order. I did not need to look at those papers. I knew every clause by heart, because I had drafted them myself 15 years ago with the guidance of the best attorneys in the city. "What the hell is this?" Richard muttered. His voice had already begun to crack, stripped of the arrogant certainty he had been wearing 15 minutes earlier. He flipped frantically through the pages, his eyes racing over legal terms. His limited mind could no longer process fast enough. That I said, taking another leisurely sip of wine is the death certificate for your greed. Then I set the glass down and smiled. But let me explain it in simple language for the people in this room who aren't trained to understand legal structures. 15 years ago, when you dragged your massive gambling debts into this house, when loan sharks were threatening to break your hands and the bank was preparing to seize everything, I stepped in and paid it all off. I sold my best-performing stock positions. I emptied my personal savings to save your miserable life. Sienna's eyes widened. She took half a step away from Richard, slipping free from the circle of his arm. Until that moment, she had still believed she was attached to a powerful man, a successful executive, a respectable older gentleman with wealth and status. My words hit her like a bucket of ice water, stripping away the illusion and exposing the truth. He had once been nothing more than a desperate debtor. But a forensic accountant like me does not throw money out the window without guarantees. I continued lightly tapping my fingertips against the table to the rhythm of victory. On the day I handed you that check, I also placed another document in front of you, a post-nuptial agreement. At the time you were shaking, crying, begging me to save you, so you signed it without bothering to read the terms. Richard jerked his head up. His face had gone white as paper. "That's impossible," he stammered. "You're lying. That agreement only covered future income divisions. It had nothing to do with this house. We bought this house together. It's marital property." I laughed, a sharp, bright, merciless laugh that rang through the elegant dining room. "You really think I would let a gambling addict co-own a $3.5 million estate, Richard?" I said. "You have underestimated the wife you just called a parasite." Then I leaned back against the carved chair and crossed one ankle over the other. "Go to page 4, I said. Read the name of the true owner of the land and the entire property in Alexandria." Richard's hand shook as he turned to the 4th page. His eyes darted wildly. His lips moved, trying to form the words, but no sound came out. "Let me help you," I said, my voice cutting cleanly through the silence. "This house, this land, this entire estate does not belong to Richard Sterling. It does not even belong to Beatrice Sterling. It belongs to a limited liability company called Sterling Holdings, LLC. And who is the sole owner of 100% of that company?" I let the silence stretch just long enough to suffocate them. "Me." I tilted my head. "I alone have owned and controlled that entity for the past 15 years. The room died. Even the crackling fire suddenly sounded deafening. The silence of collapse settled over the 4 people standing in front of me. They had built their entire perfect plan on one fatal false assumption. They thought marriage law would split the property in half. They thought Richard had the legal authority to sell this house and take his share. They had planned to carve me apart and divide the profits without ever realizing that from the very beginning they had not even been holding a knife. Marcus, the same man who had been so smugly lecturing me about cash flow and seed rounds only moments ago, now stood there with his mouth hanging open. His whole sky had fallen in. He had convinced himself that $500,000 from the sale of this house would save his dying company. That money had been his life raft. But now that raft dissolved in front of his eyes. There was no shared property. There was no $500,000 payout. There was no rescue. His glittering startup fantasy had just been crushed under the weight of a flawless legal structure drafted by the very mother-in-law he had mocked. "Mom, you're joking, right?" Chloe stammered, taking one shaky step forward. Her eyes had gone red with panic. Dad always said he was leaving this house to me. He said this was his legacy. I looked at my daughter and felt a deep pity twisted together with contempt. "Your father is a delusional man, Chloe," I said quietly. "He has never owned a single brick in this house. For 15 years he has lived in a beautiful estate and slept in a warm bed because I allowed him to. I gave him shelter so he could rebuild his life. And this is how he repaid me by betraying me, bringing a whore into my home, and conspiring with you to throw me out." Then I turned back to Richard. His face had crumpled with humiliation and bitterness. The polished image of the distinguished executive was gone. What stood in front of me now was just an old man with no money, no property, and no pride left to hide behind. "You were going to sell my house to fund your useless son-in-law," I said, taking one slow step toward him. "You were going to push me into the basement so you could move your 28-year-old mistress into my bedroom. You were going to use a medical report to strip a financial expert of her legal rights." I smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "You are almost too stupid to despise Richard. You spent 8 months sharpening your knife, and you never once checked whose ground you were standing on." Sienna, who had been silent until then, suddenly panicked. "Richard—" "What is she talking about?" she snapped, grabbing his sleeve. "You told me you had assets. You told me you were buying me a Porsche. You told me we were going to Europe after the divorce. If this house isn't yours, then where is that money supposed to come from?" "What an excellent question," I said, clapping softly twice, mocking her with every sound. "You targeted an older man because you thought he was a gold mine. But what you never realized is that mine was emptied out 15 years ago. He has nothing, Sienna, no house, no ownership stake, and certainly no luxurious future waiting for you." Richard made one last pathetic attempt to gather what little dignity he had left. "Don't listen to her, Bea," he barked. But his voice was shaking so badly the fear leaked through every syllable. "Even if the house belongs to your company, our joint bank accounts and our retirement funds are still there. I'm entitled to half of that money. You can't stop me." There it was, his final life raft. He thought that even if he had lost the house, he still had half the cash, half the retirement accounts, enough money to keep himself and his little mistress alive and comfortable for a while longer. I looked at him and slowly shook my head, like a teacher disappointed in a student too hopelessly stupid to save. "I've been waiting for you to say that, Richard," I murmured. "I've been waiting for you to bring up the bank accounts and the retirement funds you've always been so proud of." Then I turned back to the table and reached into my Hermes bag once more. This time I pulled out the second file. It was thinner than the first, but its power to destroy was no less devastating. I did not throw it down immediately. I simply held it in my hand and let my eyes drift across their 4 pale, frightened faces. They thought losing the house was the worst thing that could happen to them. They thought this Thanksgiving humiliation was already the lowest point of their lives. But they had no idea. That had only been the appetizer. The main course of judgment was just about to begin. I kept my eyes fixed on Richard's face as he struggled to hold himself together, then slowly pulled the second file from my handbag. This one was much thinner than the first, no more than 15 neatly clipped pages. But I knew those 15 pages carried enough weight to crush whatever pride he still had left, and to completely extinguish the young mistress's fantasy of a glamorous new life. I did not throw it onto the table the way I had before. Instead, I held it in my hand and tapped the stiff cover lightly against my palm, the dry little sound echoing through the room. Richard swallowed hard. He was still clinging to the hope that he at least had half the retirement fund and half the savings from our joint accounts. He still believed that money would be enough to rent some luxury apartment and keep Sienna draped in comfort. Then I turned my gaze to Sienna. She stood frozen a short distance away from Richard. Her white mink coat now looked absurdly theatrical in the reality of that room. Beneath the perfect makeup, tension had begun to show. She no longer looked like a woman standing on the summit of victory. She looked like a gambler who had just realized she had wagered everything on a crippled horse. "Sienna," I said slowly, my voice even and controlled but lethal in every syllable, "do you really think this man loves you? Do you think he's some powerful executive who can give you a life of luxury, a sports car, and lavish European holidays? Let me tell you the truth about the man you call your lover." I opened the file and pulled out the first page. "These are copies of the statements from our joint bank accounts over the last 8 months," I said, reading the figures clearly and without emotion. April 12th, $15,000 for a resort stay in St. Bart's. June 28th, an $8,000 charge at Cartier. And most notably, September 15th, a wire transfer of $120,000 sent directly to the Porsche dealership downtown. With each number I read, Richard's face turned paler. Sienna blinked again and again, her breathing growing sharper and faster. She knew those expenses very well. The St. Bart's trip was the romantic getaway Richard had told her was paid for out of his company's year-end bonus. The Cartier necklace was her birthday gift, and the bright red Porsche Macan parked outside was his 6-month anniversary present to her. "You like that car, don't you, Sienna?" I asked. My tone laced with quiet mockery. I hear the hand-stitched leather interior is exquisitely soft. But there's one small detail your distinguished Richard forgot to mention. That $120,000 didn't come from a company account or investment profits. It came straight out of our joint retirement fund. A retirement fund to which I contributed more than 70% during the years I worked myself to exhaustion before taking early retirement. Richard tried to speak. "Listen, that money, I was only borrowing it temporarily for an investment." I slammed the file down onto the table, cutting him off. The crack of it against the wood was so sharp both Chloe and Marcus flinched. "Borrowing," I said, my voice dropping into something far more dangerous. "You call stealing your wife's retirement money to buy a car for your mistress, borrowing for an investment. You spent all those years as a business executive and still learned absolutely nothing about the law, did you?" I took one step toward them. The calm in me had not vanished. It had simply changed shape. It had become pressure. As a former forensic accountant, I said I spent the last month tracing every transaction and every transfer you made. "And do you know what federal law and Virginia law call what you did?" I did not wait for an answer. "It's called dissipation of marital assets. When a husband or wife secretly uses shared funds for personal non-marital purposes, specifically to support a lover, it ceases to be a routine divorce matter. Legally speaking, what you did amounts to financial fraud and theft of marital property." Sienna took another step back. Her eyes widened in real panic now. She might not have understood every legal phrase, but she understood 2 words perfectly: fraud and theft. She looked at Richard as if he were contaminated. The man she had admired for his supposed wealth was now being stripped bare as nothing more than a pathetic thief. "Richard," she said, her voice shaking, "is what she's saying true? Is my car stolen money?" Richard could not answer. He stood there drenched in sweat, lips, pale hands trembling. He reached for Sienna's hand, but she recoiled immediately. That recoil hit him harder than a slap. "Oh, I'm not finished, Sienna," I continued, my smile growing colder. "You think that after the divorce, hell split the assets and keep taking care of you. At exactly 3 o'clock this afternoon, my attorney and I filed every piece of evidence of this fraud with the court and with the bank. An emergency freeze order has already been issued." I lifted the final page in the file and held it out in front of them. "From this moment on, every bank account, investment fund, retirement account, and credit card under Richard Sterling's name or under our joint names has been frozen. He cannot withdraw a single dollar to buy a loaf of bread, let alone pay rent for you." A small sob broke the silence. It did not come from Richard. It came from Chloe. My daughter, the daughter who had helped enable all of this, was only now beginning to understand the true brutality of the punishment. She had been counting on her father's money to save Marcus's company, but now that money had been sealed away, and the father she had worshipped was on the verge of becoming a homeless man under investigation for fraud. "He's finished Sienna," I said directly to the mistress. "This man has no house, no independent business, and no access to his accounts while the forensic investigation moves forward. By the time the court is done with him, he will be ordered to repay every dollar he siphoned off, plus enormous penalties. And if he can't pay, he'll go to prison. You're sleeping with a bankrupt financial criminal." Sienna's face collapsed. Every fantasy of wealth and luxury shattered at once. She turned to Richard with naked disgust. "You liar," she hissed. "You told me you had millions. You told me you'd take care of my future. You're just a pathetic old man living off your wife's money. Sienna, listen to me." Richard stumbled toward her, arms out, panic pouring from him. "I'll fix this. I'll hire the best lawyers. We still have a future." "A future," she snapped, slapping his hands away. "I'm 28 years old. I'm not going to court for you, and I'm not about to support some broke old man. Did you really think I was going to end up on the street with you? Forget it." She spun around and rushed toward the 3 designer suitcases sitting on the rug. Her movements were frantic now, clumsy and rough, stripped of every trace of elegance. She wanted out of that disaster as fast as possible. "Sienna." I called after her, my tone suddenly light and polite, which made it far crueler. "Are you planning to leave my house with that Chanel bag and that Cartier necklace?" She froze. "There's one more detail you should know," I said. "Those items and the luxury car outside were purchased using assets illegally diverted from me. They are evidence in a financial fraud investigation. If you take them, my attorney will add your name to the case file as an accessory in possession of property obtained through criminal conduct. So tell me, would you prefer to leave them here, or would you rather wait for the police to seize them from your apartment later?" Sienna stopped as if she had been electrocuted. Her hand dropped from the suitcase handle. Slowly, she reached up and tore the glittering diamond necklace from her throat, then hurled it onto the carpet. The Rolex came off next and followed it. Tears were streaming down her face now. Rage, humiliation, disbelief. Without looking at Richard, even once, she ran for the front door, yanked it open, and disappeared into the howling snowstorm. The heavy wooden door slammed shut behind her with a violent crash that seemed to shake the whole house. The young mistress was gone. She had abandoned the aging man in the middle of the dining room like refuse. Richard collapsed into the nearest chair and buried his face in his hands. He had lost everything: the house, the money, his dignity, and the woman he had thrown away his family for. I stood there and looked at the masterpiece I had created. Not a single drop of blood had been spilled, and yet the devastation was deeper than any physical blow. I had used nothing but intelligence law and the cold precision of numbers to crush their greed and lies. This punishment was not merely revenge for betrayal. It was a declaration of absolute power. A woman who has built her own financial empire with her own hands cannot be robbed by a husband's title or a child's ingratitude. And this was only the beginning of their removal from my life. The violent slam of the front door still left faint tremors shivering through the window panes. Richard sat collapsed in the armchair, his face buried in his hands. But he was not the only one in that dining room who had just lost everything. Marcus, my arrogant son-in-law, the man who had spent the entire evening clinging to the polished mask of a calm, sophisticated tech entrepreneur, had begun to breathe in short, sharp bursts. He understood now. Richard being stripped bare meant Marcus had just lost his final lifeline too, and the $500,000 from the sale of the house, the money he had planned to use to drag his rotting startup back from the grave, had vanished into thin air. The elegant, civilized shell around him cracked. Then it shattered. His eyes turned bloodshot. He stared at the legal files and bank statements scattered across the oak table as if they were the instruments of his execution. He could not accept the truth that a 62-year-old woman had outplayed him, exposed him, and crushed his ambitions with humiliating ease. And in that moment, all restraint left him. The primitive panic of a cornered animal surged to the surface. "You're lying to us!" Marcus roared. His voice no longer carried that false warmth, that smug executive composure. Now it was shrill, ragged, almost hysterical. He kicked his chair backwards so hard it screeched across the floor. He shouted that I could have forged a few papers to scare them, that there was no LLC, no asset freeze, no legal case. He barked at Richard to get up and call a lawyer, but Richard did not move. And that was when Marcus lost his mind completely. He lunged across the table, sweeping crystal glasses and porcelain plates onto the floor. The room exploded with the sound of shattering glass. Chloe let out a sharp scream and stumbled back, clutching her chest. Marcus did not even glance at his wife. He stretched his long arms toward the legal documents I had laid out, determined to snatch them away. He must have thought that if he tore them to pieces or threw them into the fireplace, he could somehow erase the truth itself. He believed noise and violence could overpower the law. But I did not step back. I did not flinch. I did not blink. And I certainly did not panic. I had expected this pathetic eruption. The instant his fingers came within inches of the files, I calmly raised my right hand. What I held was not a knife, not a gun, not any kind of weapon. It was only my phone. Its screen glowed in the air between us, already open to an email application. A message had been drafted in advance. All that remained was a single tap. "Stop right there, Marcus." My voice was not loud. It did not need to be. The force of it crushed his frenzy on contact. "And please," I added coolly, "don't stain my Persian rug with your desperation." Marcus froze halfway across the table, suspended in mid-motion like a man who had just realized the ground beneath him was gone. His eyes locked onto the phone in my hand. He did not yet understand what he was looking at, but the absolute certainty in my face made him hesitate. He swallowed hard, his chest heaving. I gave him a thin smile. "You can tear these papers if you like," I said. "You can shred them. Swallow them, burn them, whatever suits your little tantrum. They're only copies. The originals are sitting in my attorney's safe. But instead of acting like an uneducated thug, you might want to pay attention to your precious startup." I looked him dead in the eye. Then my thumb drifted down and pressed send. A soft, almost delicate swoosh cut through the silence. I lowered the phone slightly and spoke with maddening calm. "I just sent something very interesting, so stop staring at me, Marcus. Check your email instead. You're about to receive some news about that angel investor Auntie Sienna so generously introduced to you." And at that exact moment, the phone inside Marcus's blazer pocket vibrated with a sharp notification chime, like the toll of a funeral bell. The shrill notification tone from Marcus's phone rang out from inside his blazer pocket, sharp and piercing, slicing straight through the suffocating silence of the dining room. Every eye turned to him. His hand, still suspended in midair where he had been reaching for my legal files, suddenly froze. He swallowed hard, his chest heaving. Slowly, he pulled his hand back, dug into his pocket, and took out his phone. The glow of the screen cast a sickly light across his face, draining away the last traces of color. He swiped it open. His eyes began racing across the email. 1 second, 2, 3. I stood with my arms folded, leaning lightly against the oak chair, calmly studying every tiny change in my arrogant son-in-law's face. I watched his pupils constrict. I watched his brows pull together so tightly they almost touched. I watched his lips start trembling silently, repeating words he could no longer process. The phone in his hand began to shake because his fingers were no longer strong enough to hold it steady. "No!" Marcus finally gasped, his voice shrill and cracking apart like broken glass. He looked up at me, then back down at the screen. "No, that's impossible. They can't do this. They already signed the memorandum." Chloe rushed toward him and grabbed his arm, panic blazing across her face. "What is it, Marcus?" she hissed. "Who sent that? What's happening with the investment fund?" Marcus didn't answer her. He looked like a man struck by lightning, desperately trying to cling to the last scraps of reality. His eyes locked on mine, his breathing turning ragged. "Apex Ventures," he stammered. "Their CEO just emailed me. They said they're officially withdrawing their entire commitment to the seed round. They said my company violated the financial transparency clause. They're demanding immediate repayment of the $250,000 convertible note. If it isn't repaid within 24 hours, they'll sue and move to freeze all of the company's intellectual property. He spit out the sentence in one frantic breath, using all the business terms he had always worshipped, but now those words sounded like a death notice for his entire life. Chloe let out a strangled scream and clutched her head. Richard remained slumped in his chair, too broken now to react to anything at all. "How did you do this?" Marcus roared, taking a step toward me. He pointed a shaking finger in my face, rage and terror twisting him into something pitiful. "You called them, didn't you? You used your old Deloitte connections to destroy me? You're evil. You're destroying your own daughter's future." I laughed. A full, bright, merciless laugh that echoed through the house. Then I walked back to the table, picked up my glass of red wine, and swirled it slowly. The scent of Pinot Noir rose to meet me, carrying with it the sweet taste of victory. "You think far too highly of yourself, Marcus," I said quietly, drawing out each word with infuriating calm. "Do you really believe a former forensic accounting specialist like me would waste her time calling some irrelevant little investment fund just to smear a bargain bin startup fraud like you? Do you actually think I'd need cheap tricks to bring you down?" I set the glass back on the table, the base clicking softly against the oak. Then I looked straight into his bloodshot eyes. "Let me teach you one final lesson about business," I said. "You've always been so proud of your fundraising talent, so proud of little Auntie Sienna for introducing you to that wonderful angel fund in Silicon Valley. That magical fund called Apex Ventures, the one willing to hand you $250,000 with no collateral based on nothing but your ridiculous software fantasy." Marcus swallowed hard. He took half a step back. Some instinct deep inside him had already started whispering the truth. "Did it ever occur to you?" I continued to wonder why a professional investment firm would so easily accept a financial report full of holes. Did it ever strike you as strange that the managing partner at Apex Ventures never once showed up in person for a meeting and only communicated through email and corporate counsel? He opened his mouth. Nothing came out. The confusion on his face turned into something worse. Fear. That I said, my voice cutting through the room like steel, is because Apex Ventures does not exist as a real Silicon Valley technology fund. It is a shell company, a legal shell incorporated in Delaware. And the person behind that corporate structure, the one who approved the $250,000 note, the one you kept calling your precious angel investor, I let the silence stretch until it snapped, was me. The words detonated in the dining room like a bomb. Marcus staggered backward, caught his foot on a chair leg, and crashed to the floor. Chloe stood frozen, her eyes stretched so wide it looked as though the corners might split. Even Richard lifted his head, horror flooding his face, as he finally understood the perfection of the trap I had laid. 6 months ago, I said my tone flat and cold when I first began to suspect this family's betrayal. I quietly started investigating your entire financial network. I discovered that your company was drowning in debt and on the verge of bankruptcy. I discovered that you and Chloe both knew about Richard's affair and were planning to sell me out in exchange for money to save your company. I stepped closer to Marcus, who was now sitting on the floor, and looked down at him with open contempt. I knew exactly what you were, Marcus. Arrogant, greedy, desperate for validation, desperate for money. So I had my attorney create Apex Ventures. I used the very money you planned to steal from the sale of my house to lend to you at punitive terms, and I built a trap into the agreement, a financial transparency clause. I knew a sloppy little book cooker like you would never be able to honor. Mom, Marcus choked out, clutching his head in both hands. You trapped me? You did all this just to ruin me? No, I said coldly. I didn't trap you. I handed you a rope, and you eagerly tied it around your own neck. You lied to your wife, to your partners, and to yourself about what you were capable of. You used my loan to rent luxury office space, to buy Chloe that $3,000 Prada dress, and to fake a glamorous lifestyle. You never used that money to build technology, not the way you promised. Then I lifted my eyes to the grandfather clock on the wall, which had just struck 11. And now I said, as your sole creditor and the holder of full control over your company's collateral, I am officially calling the debt due. You have 24 hours to repay the $250,000, plus default interest and penalty charges. Do you have that money, Marcus? The room fell into a deathly silence. Of course he didn't. He did not have a cent. He had burned through every dollar feeding his fantasy. "You're finished, Marcus," I said, each word landing like a hammer. "Your company went bankrupt tonight on Thanksgiving. The source code, the servers, and even that precious brand name you love so much now belong to me. I'll liquidate the whole thing for scrap next week. That tech founder identity you built, that elite little costume you used to sneer at an old housewife, it's gone." Marcus could not say another word. He curled in on himself on the hardwood floor, his broad shoulders shaking violently. Then he buried his face in his hands and began to cry. Not dignified tears, not quiet grief, but the broken sobbing of a ruined man, a fraud exposed, a swindler unmasked, a vain, arrogant man, finally crushed beneath the weight of his own stupidity. I stood there and watched him. His tears meant nothing to me. I had given them chances. I had stayed silent for years, hoping they would one day understand the value of love, loyalty, and sacrifice. Instead, they chose betrayal. They chose theft. They chose humiliation. And in doing so, they awakened the one version of me they never should have provoked, the forensic accountant. A woman who never lets anyone take what belongs to her. The performance was over. And all that remained on that stage were the defeated waiting to be swept out of my house. Marcus had collapsed completely onto the oak floor, his broken sobs coming in jagged bursts. The grand dining room, once a symbol of elegance, power, and family prestige, now looked like the aftermath of a storm. Richard still sat frozen in the armchair, his eyes vacant, staring into nothing. The two men my daughter had always worshipped, the two men she had used to humiliate me, had both been stripped of every last ounce of power and pride. That left only Chloe. My 34-year-old daughter stood motionless in the middle of the room. Her eyes moved from her father, now utterly ruined, to the husband crumpled on the floor in disgrace. At last, the brutal truth had torn through the shell of arrogance and fantasy she had been hiding inside. She realized the endless stream of money she had always depended on had never come from Richard's brilliance or Marcus's absurd little tech dreams. Everything she owned, from the Prada silk dress draped over her body to the polished, luxurious life she loved to flaunt, had come from the patience and sacrifice of the mother she had just tried to throw away. And when every pillar around her collapsed, the ugliest instinct of a parasite finally surfaced. Chloe slowly turned toward me, her face twisted. The insolence and cold superiority from earlier were gone, replaced by a pathetic mask of sorrow. She took a few trembling steps toward me, her hands reaching out as if she expected comfort, as if she still believed she had the right to ask for it. Mom Chloe's voice shook, and tears began spilling down her carefully made-up cheeks. "Mom, I'm sorry. I didn't know what was really happening. I swear I didn't know Dad and Marcus had done such terrible things." She was lying. 15 minutes earlier, she had admitted with her own mouth that she had known about her father's affair for 8 months. She had called his mistress Auntie in that syrupy, affectionate tone. She had threatened to have me declared mentally incompetent and thrown into an institution. But now that her sight had lost, she had no hesitation turning around and sinking her teeth into the very people she had stood beside. "You have to believe me," Chloe sobbed, stepping even closer until there was less than an arm's length between us. "Dad forced me. He said if I didn't support him, he'd cut us off. And Marcus lied to me. He told me the company was doing well. He said he would take care of you. I was just being a wife. They manipulated me, Mom. You know I love you most. Please, please don't abandon me." Then she dropped to her knees in front of me. Her hands clutched at the hem of my dress as she cried harder, the weeping of a spoiled child trying to use tears to escape consequences. If I had been the woman I was 15 years ago, I might have fallen apart right there. I might have dropped to the floor, held her in my arms, and forgiven everything. A mother is programmed to protect her child no matter what. But the woman standing there that night was no longer a weak housewife. I stood straight, looking down at the daughter kneeling at my feet. No pity, no tears, no softness. The calm inside me had become something cold enough to cut with. I took one step back and peeled her hands away from my dress. "Get up, Chloe. I said flatly. "Don't ruin your designer dress and don't perform victimhood for me. You're 34 years old, not 3. You don't get to blame other people for your own cruelty." She looked up at me, her eyes wide with panic. She had never seen me like this. In her memory, I was always the woman who stepped aside. The woman who reached into the bottom of her purse for the last few bills whenever Chloe wanted a new handbag or a prettier life. "You say he lied to you," I said, pointing at Marcus, who was still curled up on the floor. "You say he promised he would take care of me. Stop pretending to have morals now, daughter. You knew perfectly well his company was collapsing. You knew his credit cards had already been declined last month, but you didn't care. The only thing you cared about was preserving your glamorous little illusion. You were willing to look away while your father betrayed me, willing to help them push me into the basement, all so you could keep your supply of money flowing." "That's not true, Mom. You've got it all wrong," Chloe tried to say, but her voice was falling apart. "I have not misunderstood a single thing." I cut in my tone, carrying the cold authority of judgment. "I'm a forensic accountant, Chloe. I read numbers, and numbers do not lie." I walked to the dining table and opened my Hermes bag again. This time I did not pull out another thick file. I took out a small black notebook. I opened it and turned the pages slowly. Every page held a record. Every page documented the money I had quietly poured into the life of the daughter now kneeling in front of me. "Listen carefully," I said, and began to read. "February of this year, $5,000 for your ski vacation in Aspen. April, $12,000 to pay off your credit card debt after your shopping spree at the mall. July, $2,000 for skin treatments and luxury spa packages. And just last week, $3,000 for the Prada dress you're so proud to be wearing tonight." With every number I read aloud, Chloe lowered her head farther. Her lips trembled. Her tears smeared the perfect makeup she had worn like armor. For all these years, I continued, then closed the notebook with deliberate calm. I denied myself everything. I wouldn't even buy myself a new winter coat because I wanted to make sure you never felt inferior to your friends. I used my savings to support both you and your incompetent husband. I hoped that protecting you this way would teach you the value of family. But I was wrong. All that money did was turn you into a selfish, cold-blooded parasite. I know I was wrong, Mom. Please." Chloe clasped her hands together in desperate pleading. "I'll change. I'll get a job. I won't waste money anymore. Just give me one chance. I'm pregnant. You can't abandon your grandchild." There it was. She was hiding behind a child not even born yet. But that trick no longer had any power over me. The cruelest punishment is not always force. Sometimes it is refusal, the refusal to keep granting the privileges someone has mistaken for love. "Don't use that baby to blackmail my emotions," I said, looking straight into her eyes. "A woman who does not know how to respect her own family has no business teaching a child how to be decent. It's time you learned how to be responsible for your own life." Then I reached into my pocket, pulled out a black credit card, snapped it cleanly in half, and let the broken pieces fall onto the floor at her knees. "The authorized user card in my name, the one you used to buy that dress, was deactivated at 5 o'clock this afternoon. There isn't a single dollar left for you on it." Chloe broke all over again. She stared at the broken card on the floor as if it were a death sentence. But I was not finished. "And as for the white Audi you drive every day," I said almost conversationally, "now did you forget? It was leased under my LLC. This morning I officially stopped the monthly payments and canceled the insurance. Tomorrow at exactly 8 o'clock, the bank and the repossession team will come and tow it away." "Mom! Mom, you can't do this!" Chloe screamed, panic spilling out of her in raw, ugly waves. "I have doctor's appointments. I need to get around. How am I supposed to live without a car? Are you trying to destroy me?" I turned my back on her and walked toward the window, looking out into the snowstorm raging in the dark beyond the glass. "I'm not destroying you, Chloe," I said without turning around. My voice was terrifyingly calm. "I'm simply returning you to where you should have been all along. A place without my protection, without my money, without your fantasies of power. It's time you learned how to ride the bus, daughter, and while you're at it, learn how to buy your own ticket with money you earned yourself." Chloe's cries dissolved into the silence of the house. The 4 people who had conspired to throw me out now stood sentenced by the very things they had mocked in me: law, financial clarity, and rightful ownership. I had not needed violence. I had not needed vulgar screaming. I had used only the truth, the law, and the power of what was legally mine to strip them of everything they valued most. And this Thanksgiving night truly was unforgettable, not because of their betrayal, but because it marked the night I finally woke up. The silence in the dining room had become so heavy it was almost impossible to breathe. Slowly, I lowered myself into my familiar chair at the head of the table, leaned back against the soft velvet cushion, and reached for my glass of red wine. The wall of arrogance the 3 people before me had worked so hard to build had completely collapsed, shattered into pieces, and scattered across the expensive Persian rug. I said nothing. My silence was no longer the silence of a wrongly accused wife or a betrayed mother. It was the absolute stillness of a monarch seated on her throne, looking down at the defeated at her feet. And so the silence stretched on, second after second, minute after minute. It hung in the room like lead. None of them dared meet my eyes. But people who have just lost everything can never hold themselves together for very long. Once greed is no longer fed, once the illusion of power is ripped away, the lowest instincts in human nature always come crawling to the surface. They began tearing each other apart. Chloe was the first to explode. She wiped the smeared tears from her face, spun toward Marcus, and looked at him with pure hatred burning in her eyes. Then she lunged at him and shoved both hands hard into his chest, the very husband she had been proudly flaunting only 15 minutes earlier. "You fraud!" Chloe shrieked. "What exactly did you promise me? You told me your company was a gold mine. You said I was going to be the wife of a tech billionaire. But you're nothing but a pathetic freeloader without a dollar to your name. You ruined my life." Marcus staggered backward, his heel catching on a chair. The wounded pride of a controlling man snapped what little restraint he had left. He no longer looked anything like a polished entrepreneur. He jabbed a finger in Chloe's face and roared back, "Oh, shut your mouth! Who do you think you are? If you hadn't spent money like a parasite, if you hadn't wasted it on all that designer garbage my cards wouldn't have been maxed out in the first place. You're just a leech with expensive taste and no ability to earn a thing for yourself. Don't dump all your filth on me." The 2 of them launched into a vicious screaming match, hurling the ugliest words they could find straight into each other's faces. Every ounce of fake sweetness, every performance of perfect love they had once used to look down on me was now being ripped to shreds by their own hands. Richard, who had been slumped in the armchair, suddenly slammed his palm onto the table. The crack of it made the remaining crystal glasses tremble. "Both of you, shut up!" he bellowed, his face flushed crimson with rage and humiliation. "You're a useless son-in-law, Marcus. You promised me equity once that company went public. You convinced me to sell this house and pour money into your mess. Because of you, I lost everything. This is your fault." Marcus turned on him instantly. A twisted, contemptuous smirk crawled across his face. "Don't stand there pretending to be the victim, Richard. You're nothing but a liar, too. You cheated on your wife, dragged a cheap little mistress into this house, and planned to use the house money to keep her. You think I didn't see it? You were going to use me to make robbing her look legitimate. Well, now, you're the one with nothing, you stupid old man. You don't get to lecture me anymore." The 3 of them, the very people who had formed a devil's alliance to corner me, were now tearing strips off one another in the middle of Thanksgiving dinner. They blamed, they screamed, they dragged each other's filthiest secrets into the open and used them like knives. Their voices echoed through the mansion, tangled with the wind, screaming outside the windows, creating the most exquisite symphony of failure I had ever heard. And me, I simply sat there, resting my chin lightly against my hand, savoring my wine. It tasted better than ever. I looked at the cold turkey on the table. At the dishes that had never even been touched before they were flung to the floor. A perfect dinner had turned into a battlefield, and yet inside me there was peace. A strange, perfect peace. I did not need to lift a finger anymore. They were doing the work of destroying themselves. I had already taken away the one thing that kept them alive: money and the illusion of power. All that remained for them now was the dead, echoing space of truth. They would keep poisoning each other for the rest of their lives. They would keep blaming, accusing, and tearing open old wounds long after this night was over. Because real power is not about shouting the loudest. Real power is when you can sit perfectly still, take a slow sip of wine, and watch your enemies burn themselves to ash in the very fire their greed created. The feast was over, and I was the only one still entitled to remain at that table. The air in the dining room still reeked of total defeat. The shouting had finally died down, but Richard was still clinging to the last scraps of his delusion. He shot up from the armchair and slammed both hands onto the oak table. His chest rose and fell violently as he dragged in a deep breath, trying to recover the posture of a patriarch, the commanding presence of a man who once barked orders and expected the world to obey. "You think you can throw me out of here, B?" He roared, his voice thick with desperation and stubborn pride. "This is my house. I've lived here for 30 years. I paid the utilities. I cut the grass every weekend. No worthless stack of papers is going to erase that. I'm not going anywhere. I'm staying in this house, and tomorrow I'll bring the best lawyer in Virginia to tear apart that fake shell company of yours." I did not even bother to smirk. I reached for my wine, took one final sip, and rose slowly to my feet. Then I walked toward the towering floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the snow-covered street of our upscale Alexandria neighborhood. With one hand, I pulled back the deep plum velvet curtain. "Richard," I said gently, as if we were discussing nothing more serious than the weather, "do you remember earlier tonight when you gave me 2 hours to pack my things and move into the basement? Unfortunately, I don't happen to possess your generous patience." The second the words left my mouth, flashes of blue and red light began strobing across the glass painting, cold streaks over Richard's pale face and Marcus's trembling frame. Then came the sirens. Not one patrol car. Two Alexandria police cruisers had pulled up directly in front of the iron gates of the estate. Their lights pulsed violently against the white snow, turning the night into something both dazzling and deeply threatening. "What the hell is that?" Marcus stammered, stumbling backward and stepping on the shards of broken glass from the crystal he had smashed earlier. Chloe clapped a hand over her mouth, staring out the window, every drop of blood draining from her face. I turned to look at the three of them. "I called them the moment you ordered me to pack my things, Richard," I said evenly. "I reported that unlawful occupants were trespassing in my home, threatening the legal owner and destroying property. Since none of you have a single document proving any legal right to remain here, the police have graciously agreed to assist me with taking out the trash." A pounding knock thundered through the house. 3 hard blows at the front door, powerful enough to reverberate through the foyer. Richard swallowed and hurriedly tried to straighten his wrinkled blazer. He rushed to the entrance and pulled the door open, forcing a diplomatic smile onto his face. "Officers, this is just a small domestic misunderstanding," he said in that familiar, smooth, commanding tone, trying to wrap himself in the authority of a respected businessman. "My wife is emotionally unstable at the moment. We're handling this privately. Everything is under control. You can go." The 2 officers stepped inside without the slightest hesitation. Their black boots crossed the threshold, bringing the bite of the snowstorm in with them. They took in the battlefield in the dining room, the shattered glass, the wrecked table. Marcus crouched on the floor, Chloe sobbing, and then their eyes settled on me, the only person still standing straight and perfectly calm. "Ma'am, are you Beatrice Sterling, the homeowner who placed the call?" One of them asked, his voice firm, one hand resting near his duty belt. "Yes, officer," I said, stepping forward with the file containing the ownership records for my LLC and the post-nuptial agreement. I handed it to him. "This property is owned solely through a separate legal entity under my control. These 3 people, my husband, who is in the process of becoming my ex-husband, along with my daughter and son-in-law, have no legal claim to remain here. I asked them to leave. They refused. They have also damaged property and threatened my safety." The officer quickly reviewed the papers. The notarized signatures and official seals were impossible to argue with. Legal proof has a way of crushing empty excuses with very little effort. He closed the file, returned it to me, and turned to Richard. "Sir, you do not have legal authority to remain on this property," he said in a hard, final tone. "You and the others need to gather your personal belongings and leave immediately. If you refuse, we will remove you and charge you with trespassing and destruction of property." Richard's eyes widened. "No, you don't understand," he stammered, throwing his hands out in outrage, his face dark red with humiliation. "I am Richard Sterling. I'm a well-known man in this city. You can't drag me out of my own house like a criminal. She's lying to you. This house is not yours in the eyes of the law." The second officer cut in coldly, stepping forward. "Let's go, sir. Don't make us use force on Thanksgiving night." But Richard's hollow pride had blinded him completely. His fragile ego would not let him walk away in front of me. So instead, he jerked his arm free, shoved at the officer's hand, and bellowed, "I'm not going anywhere. This is my house. Nobody lays a hand on me." That was his fatal mistake. The officer's patience ended instantly. With crisp, practiced movements, they moved in. Richard's arms were pulled behind his back in seconds. His screams split the air, high, furious, humiliated, as he twisted and cursed, spitting venom at everyone in reach. No one cared. Marcus panicked and bolted toward the foyer, clearly hoping to escape through the hall, but another officer stepped in from outside and cut him off. My polished, arrogant son-in-law, the man who had strutted around like Silicon Valley royalty only an hour earlier, was now sobbing and babbling that he was a tech entrepreneur, that he had done nothing wrong. The officer grabbed him by the collar of his expensive blazer and dragged him out of the dining room. That was when the scene became a masterpiece. Richard Sterling, the executive who once commanded rooms with a raised voice and a polished smile, was being hauled out like a sack of laundry, his glossy leather shoes scraping helplessly across the oak floor. Marcus thrashed and whimpered, stripped of every ounce of his fake elite image, and Chloe, tears streaming down her face, scrambled after them, clutching her designer handbags to her chest, too terrified to resist the law now that it had finally arrived in uniform. The heavy oak door was thrown wide open. The wind screamed through the opening and stormed into the house, bringing with it a brutal, bone-deep cold. The officers shoved Richard and Marcus out onto the snow-covered front steps. They stumbled, lost their balance, and crashed onto the icy path below. Then at my signal, the last officer seized the expensive suitcases Sienna had abandoned in the foyer, along with the haphazard luggage Chloe had stuffed together in panic, and tossed them outside. They flew through the air and landed in a miserable heap on the curb. One of the suitcases burst open on impact, sending silk dresses, expensive blouses, and Richard's neatly pressed shirts scattering across the snow. The storm took them instantly, soaking them, dragging them through the slush, turning all that luxury into wet, ruined fabric. I stepped out onto the porch. From the top of the stone steps, I looked down at the people who had tried to destroy me. Richard was kneeling in the snow, shaking his expensive suit, streaked with mud and melting ice. Marcus crouched beside the toppled luggage, clutching his head and groaning. Chloe stood there in her thin silk dress, hugging herself, trembling violently from cold fear and humiliation. The flashing lights from the police cars threw their pitiful shadows across the brick walls of the estate. Curtains in neighboring homes began to twitch. Balcony doors slid open. People stepped out to watch. The perfect family had fallen, and now the neighborhood was seeing every second of it. This, I thought, is the price of ingratitude. Then I turned around, stepped back inside, and slammed the heavy oak door shut. I locked all of it outside. The cold, the rot, the traitors. The sharp metallic click of the deadbolt sliding into place marked the end of a life built on patience and silence, and the beginning of a new era, an era of total freedom. Tonight, I would sleep very well in my own master bedroom. The next morning in Alexandria did not feel like any other morning I had lived through in the last 30 years. The snowstorm from the night before had disappeared, completely replaced by a bright winter sky washed in sharp golden light. When I opened my eyes in the master bedroom on the second floor, there was no loud snoring beside me, no cheap cologne in the air, no heavy presence of traitors poisoning the space around me. The house was silent, not empty, free. A silence so pure and exquisite it felt holy. I slipped out of bed, bare feet sinking into the thick wool rug, and walked to the window. A clean white blanket of snow covered the front lawn. The chaotic marks from the suitcases thrown outside the night before, the tracks from the police cars, all of it had already been covered by fresh snow, just as I had erased them from my life. No debris, no remains, no trace worth keeping. At exactly 9 o'clock, the doorbell rang. This time, it was not some brazen little mistress arriving to steal a husband. It was the managing broker from the luxury real estate firm I had contacted weeks ago. He entered with a polished smile and a leather portfolio containing something far more valuable than revenge release. We sat down at the very same oak dining table where the night before a psychological bloodbath had unfolded. I had cleaned every shard of glass before sunrise. Now the table held only 2 hot espressos and a stack of sales documents. I had already made my decision. The estate would be sold to a commercial investor for $3.5 million paid in full in cash. "Everything has been thoroughly reviewed by your attorney, Mrs. Sterling," the broker said respectfully. "You only need to sign in the final 3 places. Once the signatures are confirmed, the funds will be wired directly into your personal Swiss trust account." I picked up the gold pen, the same pen Marcus had used the night before when he thought he could threaten me with it. I smiled and lowered it to the paper. My signature flowed across the contract in smooth, elegant strokes. No hesitation, no regret, no second thoughts. When the final line was complete, one sorrowful chapter of my life ended forever. I slid the papers back to the broker. That house had once been a home. Then it had become a prison. And now it had become a ticket to the brightest chapter of my life. At 10:30 that morning, I walked down the staircase for the last time. I was not wearing an apron. I was not dressed in faded colors and dutiful silence. I wore a cream silk suit expertly tailored to perfection beneath an expensive shearling coat. My heels clicked against the marble with unapologetic grace. Behind me rolled a single suitcase. Just one. I did not take the fake family photographs. I did not take a single bitter souvenir from 30 years of marriage. I took only what was mine, and I walked away with a financial foundation stronger than ever. At the front entrance, I placed the house keys on the small wooden table by the door. The sound of metal touching wood rang out sharp and clear. Then I opened the door, stepped outside, and drew in a deep breath of the freezing winter air. It was cold. It was clean. It was glorious. A sleek black luxury car was already waiting at the curb. The chauffeur, dressed in immaculate uniform, stepped out, opened the door for me, and placed my suitcase inside. "Dulles International Airport," I said softly. The drive to the airport passed in perfect calm. I watched the streets of Virginia slide by through the window. I did not know where Richard had slept the night before. I did not know whether Chloe and Marcus were still screaming at each other in some miserable roadside motel, and I did not care. They were no longer part of my world. Their existence had been reduced to what it always should have been, a lesson, and I had graduated with perfect marks. The first-class lounge at the airport was quiet, elegant, and untouched by chaos. Check-in took only minutes. My flight was not some ordinary domestic route. I walked down the jet bridge and entered the first-class cabin of an international airline. A beautiful flight attendant greeted me with a warm, polished smile and led me to a wide leather seat designed for people who no longer begged life for permission. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Sterling," she said. "Would you care for a glass of champagne before takeoff?" "A chilled one, please," I replied with a radiant smile. As the aircraft began to move down the runway, I leaned back into the softness of the seat and lifted the champagne to my lips. The bubbles broke on my tongue with the taste of absolute freedom. My destination was the Amalfi Coast, one of the most breathtaking places in all of Italy. I would rent a small villa draped in bougainvillea overlooking the Mediterranean. I would spend my days reading, eating beautifully, walking in the sun, and remembering what it feels like to belong only to myself. People love to say that a woman in her 60s is entering the evening of her life. They say women at 60 should stay home, arrange flowers, raise grandchildren, and accept the fate their children hand them. They are wrong. My life did not end at 62. It began. It began the moment I swept every parasite out of it. I turned the champagne glass slowly in my hand, watching the sunlight catch in the crystal. For one fleeting second, I remembered Chloe crying the night before. Somewhere deep inside me, the mother who had raised her felt the faintest ache. But the stronger part of me, the wiser part, extinguished it immediately. The cruelty of that night had been salvation, for me. And perhaps one day for her too. They needed a fall brutal enough to wake them up, and I needed a cut sharp enough to set myself free. The plane climbed into the sky, rising through layers of white cloud, leaving behind a small city filled with small, greedy people. The flight would last many hours, but I did not feel tired. My heart felt weightless. The future stretched before me bright and open and entirely my own. No more burdens, no more betrayal, no more midnight sighs in the dark. I was Beatrice Sterling, a financial expert, a free woman, and the only person who would ever control my fate again. The years ahead were not an afterthought. They were not leftovers. They were the most golden years of my life, and they had only just begun. As I sat on that flight to the Amalfi Coast, watching the clouds drift past my window, I realized a bitter truth that was also strangely liberating. People love to tell women like us that sacrifice is a noble kind of jewelry. They tell us that if we spend our youth stepping back, lifting up our husbands, protecting our children, and building a home with our bare hands, then one day at the end of it all, we will be rewarded with love, gratitude, and respect. I believed that lie too. I believed it for 15 years. I put away my credentials as a financial expert. I locked up my own ambitions and wrapped myself in the apron of a housewife. I convinced myself that if I endured enough, if I gave enough, if I stayed patient long enough, then one day I would be repaid with a peaceful old age. But reality slapped me across the face at the Thanksgiving table. Sacrifice does not create respect, not by itself. When you turn yourself into a doormat, people will wipe their feet on you without hesitation. When you keep giving to the ungrateful, they stop seeing it as love. They start seeing it as obligation. They will strip away everything you have, and the moment you no longer serve a purpose, they will shove you into the basement or into a nursing home and call it practicality while they steal what is yours. The most expensive lesson I learned at 62 was not how to forgive. It was how to draw a line. Family is not an unbreakable shield. The only real protection against human greed is clear boundaries and financial independence. If I had not kept a separate fortune for myself, if I had not understood the law, then last night I would have been the one dragging a suitcase into the snow while my treacherous husband and his young mistress took over my bedroom. Money cannot buy love, but it can buy power. And power gives you the right to say no to trash. So now I want to ask everyone listening to this story, if you are in your 50s or your 60s, if the very people you loved most are draining you dry and treating you like disposable furniture in the very home you built, what would you do? Would you keep your head down, swallow your tears, and suffer in silence? Or would you pick up the phone, call a lawyer, and take back what belongs to you? Tell me your story. Leave a comment below and let me know. Would you choose surrender, or would you choose resistance? Never believe that age is a barrier. Never believe it is too late to fight for your freedom. You do not need to live on anyone's mercy. My name is B. I am 62 years old, and my real life has only just begun. Thank you for listening. You for